Hey guys, it's Rush. Hope you're doing well. Welcome back to the channel. This video today, I'm covering the Turtle Beach Stealth Pivot Controller. This controller basically is 2-in-1. It is an Xbox controller and it comes with the standard Xbox layout. However, you can rotate the modules on either side to create a more fight pad style layout, as you can see on screen right now. To rotate the modules, you have to unlock them using the two settings on the back. And this then enables you to rotate both sides of the controller. So this reveals the standard layout, the Xbox style layout. So this is excellent because normally a fight pad would be useless outside of a fighting game, but this is the best of both worlds. You're essentially getting two pads for one with the way this is customizable. The shape and the feel of this pad is very similar to the Thrustmaster eSwap controllers. I've had two different models of those now, and as I mentioned, it feels very similar. The way it sits in your hands, the shape of the pad, the handles, even down to the thickness and the shoulders, very, very similar to the Thrustmaster models. The pad feels very solid, very well built. It weighs in at just under 300 grams, so there's a lot of weight to the controller, and I really like that. The buttons feel solid, shoulders feel very solid, and the triggers, they feel really nice. They don't feel cheap and tacky, they feel really good. You do have a toggle here to change the travel distance of the triggers. So I've got it set to the shorter distance, which is really nice to have that feature. On my previous video, I mentioned that I prefer shoulders over triggers for those back buttons, but having the ability to reduce the travel is really good. And again, it works. It works for fighting games. If you want the longer travel for other games, you have that customizability with this pad. Connectivity, you can use the pad wired, it's USB Type-C, or you can use a wireless dongle to connect it to your devices. And on the back, there's two mappable buttons. There is a 3.5mm audio jack in the bottom. You have profiles, so you can customize different profiles for the button configuration via the software, and it has vibration functionality. So the big question is it good for fighting games? I feel the build of the pad, the shape, the size of the pad, and even the button layout is very good. The D-pad is a good size and it has a lot of resistance to it, so it's not a pivot style D-pad. When I'm clicking the directions, it feels like each direction is its own button. So you've got 8 individual buttons as the directions, and it'll click into each button as you go around on the D-pad. So getting individual directional inputs is really good. The feedback is nice. The actual D-pad itself, when you press down on it, there's a lot of resistance, so it's not very sensitive, should I say. So it's not very sensitive. You just put a bit of force against the D-pad to get your inputs, but I quite like that. I'd probably say it's a bit too stiff for my liking, but I do like the resistance because the thing, as I mentioned before with D-pads, is if it's too sensitive, if it's too light to the press, you'll get misinputs. The size of the D-pad is a good size, so that will, again, will help with misinputs. You won't get that many misinputs because the D-pad's not huge, it's not overly sensitive. But this D-pad does have a lip to it, so it dips in, it's concaved, and your thumb sits on the edges of the circle. So it's a little strange. Like, I'm not that fond of it, and I'll talk about this more when it comes to gameplay, but inputs are very clean. But they're very difficult to get on this controller, if that makes sense, because you've got to press harder and your thumb literally sits on the edge of the D-pad. It's an odd design. I would say that if this D-pad wasn't concaved, then it would be a lot better. It's very difficult to feel where your thumb is in the middle of the center of the pad, and going from quick inputs, from back to forward to down, it can be tricky because, again, your thumb's balancing on the circular part, the outer part of the D-pad. Looking at the D-pad in alignment with the buttons, you can see the D-pad sits nice and high. I like that. It's not too high, but it's not low. That's great. But it's not really in line with the buttons. So when I first played Street Fighter with this pad, I was pressing B, thinking B was A, because naturally my thumb would be there. So these two buttons here, X and Y, when you rotate this module, they do sit lower than what I'm used to, but it's not a massive issue. It's not as bad as the Victrix controller. That they sit really low, and I don't like that. But this is not too bad. The button size, they're quite small, and they do have a polish, like a slippery surface. I do like the surface. I think matte is better, just for like grip and things, but that is not too bad. It does feel nice. but they are small. So I'd say the button sizes being bigger would be better, but it's not too bad. I'm getting good execution, good inputs when I use the buttons. The face buttons are not micro switches, they're just standard buttons, but there is some force required to press them down. They're not too sensitive, but they feel solid. I much prefer this over the micro switches. Shape and design. So it's got a thick face, it's got the handles. I love that. You do have a nice solid grip on the control pad. As I mentioned, there's weight to it, there's thickness to it, and the shoulders, they're general or typical shoulder slash trigger buttons. So they are big, they are close, but having big buttons and close together isn't too bad. The paddles, this is interesting. So I don't really like the paddles. I've tried them in Street Fighter 6 and I opt not to use the paddles as my mapped buttons. But the good thing about these paddles are, if I press them, it takes some time to actually press them down. There's resistance. And I think that's super important for paddles because you can accidentally press the paddles down. So that's really well designed. They've thought about that, having resistance on them so you don't accidentally press. So the last thing I want to mention is the left stick button and the right stick button. These buttons normally are found as the additional buttons, the additional 6 buttons, 5 and 6 on the face of the pad. But here, you technically have, well, you don't technically, you do have 8 face buttons. So they've got dedicated LSB, RSB. The mappable buttons, the only mappable buttons you have are P1, P2, and P3, P4 on the back of the controller. You cannot remap, as far as I can see in the software, any of the stock buttons. So these cannot be changed, they cannot be changed, these cannot be changed. So for Street Fighter 6 specifically, I've got P1 and P2 set to left stick button and right stick button. So I have dedicated face buttons. These are the same, L1, L2, R1, R2, and I don't use the back buttons. So this is the Turtle Beach software. So once downloaded to your machine and opened up, connect your controller and you can go into the configuration of the control pad. You have to set up a profile before you make any changes. So I created a RG_SF profile, move that to slot 1 of the controller. Once that's done, you can then go into the settings. You can see at the top there, it says editing RG_SF. So buttons, as I mentioned, P1 and P2 are set to left stick button, right stick button. I don't have P3, P4, the paddles on the back set to anything. The triggers themselves, this is interesting. So if you reduce the travel of the triggers, so this one is set to minimal travel, and this means that the trigger is either on or off. If I just touch it ever so slightly, I either get the input or I don't. It actually doesn't have any dynamic travel recorded in the control pad, whereas this one, I've removed the lock, so it's set to like full travel, and it is dynamic. You can see it depends on how much force I press. So let's change that back, and hopefully, yep. So there you go. It's switched to on or off now. It's just on, off. It's not dynamic. And then from here as well, I've turned vibration off. You know, you can change the lights and things. There's quite a lot of things you can do. I didn't mention about the display, but you have a display as well. It shows battery power. It tells you what profile you're on. One thing I did notice about this app is there's no way to close it without going to taskbar and killing it from the taskbar. So that's, you know, a small gripe, but not a big issue. So how does the pad feel with Street Fighter 6? So what I know specifically is that directional inputs in isolation are very clean. So dashing, jumping, quarter circle inputs, even DP itself is very easy to do on this control pad. The pad is very uncomfortable though, because my thumb is pressed against the edge of the circle, the outer circle, the lip of the D-pad. It is quite uncomfortable. Your thumb gets very sore very quickly, I notice, but maybe that's because of the way I'm holding the D-pad. But the inputs are very clean in isolation, like I mentioned. But what I have noticed, and I'll show this in some of the gameplay clips, is where you want inputs very quickly or where you have to string multiple inputs together, particularly DP into super when on the left-hand side. I found it very tricky to do that consistently. So testing the controller in Tekken. Now I play Law, and Law's inputs are all directional inputs. Law doesn't have any quarter circle or DP inputs. The pad feels very good. The D-pad particularly feels really good in Tekken. The inputs are very crisp, very clean. I can get dashing, sidestep very, very easily. And doing Law's slide. So Law's slide it's not a hard input to do, but it's something that I find some D-pads struggle with this, some D-pads don't. The slide comes out really easy on this D-pad. So this echoes what I said before. I feel individual inputs or directional inputs are really good on this pad, but I feel more complex quarter circle and DP type inputs are more tricky. In Street Fighter 6, initially it was a good experience, but as time went on, I struggled quite a bit. It was difficult to get DP into Super on the left consistently, even in training mode. Trying to get DP raw or Super raw in tight spots, that was very difficult. I think that's down to the fact that the D-pad's quite stiff. The only feedback I had from my thumb to the D-pad itself was me pressing on the outer edge, so I didn't really feel like I knew exactly where I was on the D-pad at all times. That's why I feel like my movement was restricted in Street Fighter 6. And something else really weird, whenever I did drive rush cancel on hit or on block, my follow-up attack, my standing or crouching normal, sometimes I would get DP and I couldn't figure out why that was happening. I wasn't pressing the D-pad, but I'd get a dragon punch, which would obviously be bad on block. And that happened a lot during my session, which is very strange. Tekken though, a different story. It felt natural throughout. Movement felt great, my inputs felt precise, and again because my character Law has directional inputs for his specials, I was getting his special moves without any problems at all. So highly rated for Tekken. For me personally, it felt great for Tekken, but not so good for Street Fighter, and it is because of the D-pad. Overall, a fantastic pad, a lot of functionality. I love the fact that it's two pads in one. So it may be for you. I think it's a good controller overall, but for me, for a serious fight pad, because the D-pad is not up to par, I would not choose it for my go-to fight pad. Let me know what you think. Have you tried this pad? Let me know your thoughts. Be interested to hear your opinions. Any questions or any queries, as always, give me a shout, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.